In our last study, we talked about the life of Erasmus, one of the greatest figures of the 16th century. And in our study today, I want us to focus on what Erasmus actually believed. And that's going to be important when we come to the great conflict that he had with Luther. We've got to understand what these two men believed, and that helps us to understand the conflict. And it's important that we ourselves look at our own understanding and ask ourselves what we believe, because that's going to shape so many things that we do and the attitudes that we have. Erasmus was really not a theologian, but he was committed to Christian reform and committed to the Bible. He believed in a concept which he called the philosophy of Christ. Well, this means that Christianity to Erasmus was a philosophy. Philosophy is a love of wisdom. So he was really saying that the Christian life is the wisest way to go. It's the best way to live. It holds the most advantages for you. You're better off being a Christian than you would be if you were not. And he wanted to sell Christianity to people really on that basis. He puts his emphasis on the pragmatic, on that which works, on that which does something. He wasn't as concerned about the lofty doctrines of salvation and grace as he was on how does it play out in everyday life. How do you live your Christian life? And remember that Erasmus was essentially a humanist. And this linked him in one regard to the humanist Renaissance movement in Italy, where the emphasis was always on morality, on the way you live. Not so much on personal salvation, but on morality. Now, no one ever believed that morality was unimportant. It's a matter where the stress was. And we'll see later with the Reformers, the most important thing was the relationship with God, which involved the doctrines of salvation. And from that flowed the morality. But with Erasmus, the most important thing was the morality. And he saw that morality is played out in the best way when we follow Christ. And in that regard, even though there's some scholars who disagree, it seems to me that he was really pursuing the same course as the Devotio Moderna, the modern devotion. People like Thomas à Kempis on the imitation of Christ. Do good works. Lead a spiritual life. Follow the example of Christ. Now, to do that, it was necessary that they know the Bible. And they know it well, because from the Bible would communicate to them the great moral lessons and the great example of Jesus. So Erasmus was not a theologian as much as he was a philologist. That is, one who loves the study of language and the words themselves. The words communicate to you. The Scriptures became to Erasmus the source for moral instruction that a person needs to follow Christ. And because that is so important, Erasmus believed that everyone should have access to the Scriptures. The common plowboy out in the field, plowing the field, he should be able to read the Bible in his own language. And most of the time the Bible was in Latin. Very few common people knew Latin. And so it was just for the well-educated. But he wanted to make the Bible available to everybody in the language that they spoke. And he wrote that in a preface to his New Testament text called the Paraclesis, 1516. Remember that Erasmus' New Testament text was the text from which the King James translators translated the King James Bible in 1611, and the same text that Martin Luther translated the German Bible from in 1522. Very important text, still is highly regarded today. And we're going to look tonight to try to nail down what Erasmus really believed at two of his works out of so many. If you try to put together all the things that Erasmus wrote, let me tell you, they are available in huge books oversized books that have to be put in the oversized section of libraries. Thick. The print is tiny. It's like newspaper columns with tiny print, all in Latin, of course. And it would take you years just to read through, I think, all the works, the Opera Omnia, all the works of Erasmus. Until recently, much of his works were not even translated into English. But there has been an effort in the last few years to translate and make them available in English. We're going to look, though, at two of his works that are translated into English, that you can go buy in the bookstore. One is called the Enchiridion Militis Christiani, which translated is the Handbook of the Christian Soldier. It was published in 1512. Roland Bainton, the late Roland Bainton, was an historian who was an excellent biographer of both Erasmus and Luther. He wrote Luther's famous biography, Here I Stand, and he wrote the one of Erasmus, Erasmus of Christendom. Bainton says of Erasmus and of the Enchiridion, more than any other of his works, it was made the mouthpiece of the liberal Catholic reform, the counselor of popes, and the mentor of Europe. This is the book that was the main basis of Erasmus' program of reform. He was committed to cleaning up the church, reforming the church, making the church more spiritual, because the church was engaged in so much that was corrupt. Immoral behavior among the clergy, greed, selfishness, materialism, buying of offices, and all of that. There was a lady who was married to a man by the name of Johann Poppenreuter. And she knew Erasmus. She came to him and asked him to write this letter, as it was originally, to her husband. Her husband was a manufacturer of armaments in Nuremberg. By the way, Nuremberg, Germany, which later became the Nazi capital and was totally obliterated in World War II by the Allies, was, during this time, the largest city in Germany and the most cultured city in Germany. And he lived in Nuremberg, but he treated his wife abusively, was very unkind and cruel to his wife, and had numerous affairs with other women. And his wife, a gentle Christian lady, had put up with this behavior. She came to Erasmus and said, "Would you write something to my husband that would encourage him to be a better Christian, to treat me better, and to behave more morally?" Well, Erasmus not only accommodated the lady, but he wrote this book and had it published that became one of his best-known works. He handed him a spiritual dagger. He handed him the book. He wrote it to him. He said, "Here it is, Johann." Johann got out his real dagger, his physical knife, dagger, and handed it to him. "Here's my dagger," he said. Well, as far as we know, neither one of them ever made use of the other's weapon, because Erasmus was a committed pacifist, would never hurt anybody. And I'm afraid that Johann was really not interested in spiritual matters. But how many other people have read this book through the years? Now, in this, Erasmus was probably preaching to himself as much as he was to Poppenreuter. He makes in it a couple of main points. The first main point in the Enchiridion, in the handbook, is a call to action in Christian warfare. Now, Erasmus didn't believe in literal warfare, but he did believe that we're fighting a spiritual battle, and he was calling the soldiers of Christ to arise and put their armor on, as it were. He urged Christians to be courageous because the victory is assured. God is the ally of the Christian, and the outcome rests not with fortune, but with the Father. Not with luck or chance, but with God. If we fail to conquer, Erasmus says, it's because we haven't wanted to conquer. Christ will fight for you, he said, but you must do your part, not relying supinely on divine grace, not lying on your back, waiting for God's grace. You've got to do your part. Clearly you can see Erasmus believed You do your part, God does his part. It's a double part situation. The war is with the self, according to Erasmus, more than anything else. He did not see a battle with the devil because he didn't believe in a literal devil. He saw the devil as kind of a symbol of evil, including the evil of the self and the evil of the world and the flesh. But the real battle, the greatest struggle of all, is with yourself, your unspiritual self, your selfish self. That must be conquered. Erasmus spiritualized everything that was external, even the worship of the church. He saw it in spiritual terms. What's important is the spiritual meaning, he said, not the external thing. So some accused him of reducing Christianity to an attitude. It's all the spirit that counts. It's what's in your heart that counts. He really put such a stress on that it would seem almost that he was neglecting the physical acts of one's life. So the first main point is a call to action in Christian warfare. The second main point is imitating Christ. In our world today, we have an expression, what would Jesus do? Well, that's a call to imitate Jesus. And so this is the same thing. Thomas à Kempis had written on the imitation of Christ. What would Jesus do? Imitate Christ. And much of this book calls for people to live like Jesus. That's the best way to live. Imitate him in spirit. Keep his ethical precepts literally. Have the heart of Christ, the spirit of Christ. And when he commands something ethically, do that literally. Maybe he's trying to eliminate the times when Jesus went off on the Pharisees and called them a bag of snakes and things like that, which wasn't very gentle and kind. So you look for the Spirit of Christ, and you cultivate the gentler virtues, humility, meekness, compassion. Overcome evil with good. Practice forgiveness. Do everything from an inner heartfelt faith. He stressed that even the outward forms of worship are abomination to God if they hinder our love and service to our neighbors. He said we need to detach ourselves from the world, from this world of sense and material things. Detach ourselves and be lost in the world of the Spirit. The spiritual should always be preferred above the physical. Now some of you hearing these words may say, wait a minute, that rings a bell. That sounds a bit Platonic. A bit like the philosopher Plato, who says reality is in the spiritual things, not in the physical things. And it is interesting that the two books that we're talking about tonight are the only two books that Erasmus ever wrote in which he was influenced by Platonism, in which he used Platonic ideas. But he had been at the University of Paris, he had met some Platonist friends, and he had picked up some of the Platonic ideas. He never was really a Platonist, but he found it very convenient to illustrate his point here about the spiritual. He said the insignia of the Christian, the signs that we wear, are the cross, the crown of thorns, the nails, the lance, and the wounds. Well, you think about what he's saying here. Of course, we should be known by the fact that we suffer for Christ. We bear the wounds of Christ, not from our crowns and beautiful robes and rings and all of the trappings of the Pope and the bishops. He found that disgusting. What's important is, do you show the wounds of Christ in your life? Very spiritual-minded person. And he said these things are true for all Christians, not just the clergy. They're true for you, Johann, for anybody. Everybody should live this way, should live like Christ. And when you go out in the warfare, in the Christian warfare, your weapons are prayer and the Scriptures. Take prayer and the Holy Scriptures. And the Scriptures he did not interpret in a literal sense. He interpreted them in an allegorical sense. They're allegories. They are symbols of something. They represent something. He stayed away from that literal sense. That bothered him. And so the Handbook of the Christian Soldier is perhaps the most plain, simple statement of Erasmus' beliefs, and was the heart of his reform program, because he believed that if you put the Bible in the hands of people and you teach them the Bible, and you get a general direction of moving toward the spiritual, that there will be a great change in the church and reform in the church, and it will clean up the corruption. Now, the other great work that we're going to be looking at that helps us to understand the belief system of Erasmus is a book that is still popular today. It's still often taught in schools, in literature courses. It's called The Praise of Folly, or Encomium Moriae. He was a very good friend of Thomas More. Sir Thomas More, a man for all seasons, the man who lost his head on the chopping block to Henry VIII because he would not agree that Henry was the head of the church in England. He remained loyal to the Pope, as Erasmus was a very loyal Catholic, and would not join with the Protestants, even though they put great pressure on him to do it. Neither would he agree to line up behind and agree with everything the Pope said and did. He wanted to be free to criticize the Pope when he felt the Pope and the clergy were wrong. He wanted that freedom. He wanted a middle ground, but he did not intend to leave the Roman Church. Well, Thomas More and Erasmus shared these views. Thomas More had a house in Chelsea, and the humanist scholars met there. Even Prince Henry, when he was on good terms before he was King Henry VIII, would meet there with Thomas More and John Colet and William Grocyn and Thomas Latimer and the others. And he was on his way to spend some time with Thomas More, his beloved friend. And it was customary when you go to somebody's house then that you would take them a house present. So he thought, well, what am I going to offer to my friend Thomas? I will write him something. I'll write him something. It'll be my house present for him. He was crossing the channel. He hated crossing the channel. He got seasick. He didn't like that. Trying to keep his mind off the rough channel water. And he thought about what he would write. Well, I'll write something in honor of More. The word honor, encomium, praise, honor. Moriae. The Latin Moriae would be of More. So encomium, Moriae would be in Latin in praise of More. But then he laughed. Something funny struck him. The word more in Greek means fool. So in Greek, that would be translated in praise of foolishness, in praise of folly. And he laughed. He chuckled. This is great. I'll write something funny for my friend, in praise of folly. So in the praise of folly, which later, by the way, he said, I was really sorry I wrote it. I put my name on it. He was afraid it would get him in trouble with the Pope when he needed the Pope's endorsement for that Greek New Testament text that was coming out in 1516. So he's a little bit ashamed and scared of the effect of what he wrote in that. But at the time, he thought it was downright funny. But it really starts out in a lighthearted way. And Erasmus speaks through the goddess Folly. Now this is kind of a parody of a late classical work written by Boethius, living in Italy. Boethius wrote The Consolation of Philosophy. And in that, wisdom is a goddess. And wisdom blesses people. And you have great consolation through wisdom. Well, now he makes folly a goddess. He makes foolishness a goddess. And his point is that everybody worships folly. We're all foolish. And he says, if we weren't foolish, life would be boring. It wouldn't be any fun. That's what makes life bearable, is the fact that we know how to be foolish. We can't take ourselves too seriously. If we don't ever laugh and lighten up, it would be a terrible existence. And so folly wears different masks. She looks differently in different places, but she's always there. And everybody ultimately worships folly. Now you think about it. Children have lots of fun, don't they? But they're just as foolish as they could be. And when people get old and kind of senile, they act childish, and they're old age. Well, that makes old age bearable when you go back to being a child. Now, it's kind of childish, too. When your hair falls out, to make an artificial wig thing and put it on there. That's foolish. That's vanity. Well, we enjoy it a lot more when we look like we got hair that we don't have. It isn't real. Same way with false teeth. Your teeth fall out, you get dentures. They did even then. So somebody makes you some false teeth. You look normal again. That's foolish. Those aren't real teeth. But you see, it makes life more enjoyable when we act foolish. We do foolish things. You see some lady and you say, oh, you really look great, when she looks terrible. But you don't want to really tell her what she looks like. And when you lie to her and you're foolish about it, she feels okay. She feels good about it. And when you get up in the morning, if you tell your wife what she really looks like, you might get in trouble. So you don't. You see, we're foolish. To be specific, as he goes through this, he says, folly keeps the human race going through marriage. That's a foolish thing. Folly builds cities and empires and overrides prudence. Folly makes social relations bearable because we're not truthful in those social relations. Folly blesses mankind with ignorance. He says, look at the moron. He's the happiest of all. And then he says, the scholars are foolish. And he even includes himself. He jokes about the fact even Erasmus is foolish. Scholars are foolish. Merchants are foolish. Doctors are foolish. Children are foolish. Old people are foolish. Women are foolish. Grammarians, lawyers, kings, ladies of the court. And we read through this first section, and it is funny, and it's like a mirror, and we see ourselves in it. We see society in it, and we say, oh, yes, that's true. But then he comes to the second section, and he goes right on pointing out foolishness, and he satirizes the monks and the popes and the bishops and the cardinals, and you laugh, and then something within you wants to say, but wait a minute. Wait a minute. When popes and bishops and monks and cardinals, these leaders in the church, are so foolish, is this right? When they are fools and they are our spiritual guides, is that what we want? And of course, that's exactly where he wants you to be. He wants you to think along that line because he really wants you to think seriously about how corrupt the church is. And Erasmus and the humanists are the most serious about this, and they deliver the most scathing rebukes of corruption within the church. And then he comes to the third section, and that final section of Praise of Folly, and he gets very, very serious. And you can almost sense the change of the tone when he says, but the worst fool of all is the Christian. And he goes to that passage in 1 Corinthians 4:10 where Paul says, we are fools for Christ's sake. And you think for a moment, yes, that is true. In the eyes of the world, the true Christian will always appear to be a fool. The cross is foolish. And Paul talked about the foolishness of the cross and the preaching of the foolishness of the cross, but it is the power by which God saves us. And you realize that always the cross must appear to the world to be a foolish thing, and the Christian must appear to be a fool if we really are truly Christians and we're really preaching the cross. And this gets to be very serious and really makes us think deeply about who we are and about what the message is that we are delivering. So from these two works of Erasmus that we have looked at, from the Enchiridion and the Praise of Folly, which are the two that are perhaps best recognized as exemplifying the theology of Erasmus. In one sense, Erasmus is saying the same thing in both of them. He is saying the same thing in irony and in satire in Praise of Folly that he is saying straightforwardly and openly in the Enchiridion. And let's see if we can sum that up in a few points. First of all, he shows the irrational to be the rational, because the rational is shown to be the irrational. In other words, that which people consider to be rational upon investigation is seen to be irrational. And that which people consider to be irrational upon investigation is truly rational. Things are not what they seem. And when we look at things from the Christian viewpoint, we will see that they are not what the world considers to be real, true, and rational. It's a different conclusion we're going to reach. And secondly, he illustrated by his commentary on the scriptural verse, all is vanity, where he uses the same list in praise of folly, just exactly what he's talking about. In his list in all is vanity, in his commentary, he's saying, yes, these things are vain and wrong, and he makes you laugh at them in praise of folly, but he teaches them straightforwardly in his commentary. Either way, he's trying to get you to think seriously, whether he has you laughing or whether he's just making the point. It's an ironic version of a medieval concept, which in Latin is called the contemptus mundi, contempt of the world. And throughout the Middle Ages, there was always this idea that was generated, we ought to despise this world. But he does it in not a purely medieval sense, but in a way in which he blends, in true humanist fashion, Christian and classical themes. And fourth, it represents the true emancipation from the world of the senses, of being able to free ourselves from the senses and spending oneself in the pursuit of the world's agenda through a folly of another sort, a spiritual folly. It's the divine rapture of Plato that transcends reason, the divine self-emptying of the Christian who pursues his earthly pilgrimage with fidelity and detachment as he follows Christ. And the conclusions I have just given you, I have borrowed, and I'm going to tell you I borrowed them from the great scholar Roland Bainton and his book Erasmus of Christendom. And it's interesting that Bainton wrote both on Erasmus and Luther. And we will turn our attention next to Luther.